Our relationship was not one where he was coming home every night drunk, yelling at me, calling me a bitch, stuff like that. It wasn't that. And I think that's what most people assume that verbal abuse is that it's just name calling. Let me tell you, honey, verbal abuse is so much more than name calling. It's so much more. Hey, what's good, YouTube fam? It's your girl, Gracesandra. Today, we are going to be talking about what is verbal abuse, the bare bones. I'm coming to you as a survivor, not a psychiatrist or a counselor. I don't have a degree in this. I do have a degree in speech communications, but that doesn't count for this purpose. But I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm not a professional, but I am someone who lived it. And as a result of living it, I had to really do a lot of research to figure out how to survive it. I'm just going to be talking about what verbal abuse is and just a little bit of examples about how it played out in my life. And if you want to learn more about my story, I did do a 4-part series on what I went through to survive very severe verbal and narcissistic abuse in a 5-year marriage. So I'm going to be using this book as a reference. This is probably the world's foremost book on verbal abuse by Patricia. She also has 3 or 4 more books on verbal abuse. If you think you might be going through it, I would highly suggest Patricia Evans. These books have changed my life. I have this one, my hard copy, but I also have her other books in my Kindle, and I've went back to them several times. So I'm just going to be referencing this because she has 25 years experience and I wouldn't even pretend to know more than her, and I've learned so much from her. But what I want to share is just the basics and then how it played out for me. What is verbal abuse? First of all, verbal abuse, as I've come to understand it, is when someone uses verbal interactions to constantly take power over the other person. In every single interaction, they take power. And of course, there's a number of different behaviors and ways that a verbal abuser does that. One of the most common ways that verbally abusers abuse is through defining someone else's inner world. And what that means is they're often telling the victim what they're thinking, lying to them about what they're thinking, lying to them about who they are, lying to them about their identity. It's a form of gaslighting. Some of the behaviors around verbal abuse are gaslighting, discounting, criticizing, blocking, trivializing, of course, name calling. I think one of the biggest things that was challenging for me as a victim of verbal abuse is that everybody just assumed it was name calling. That's what I assumed verbal abuse was. It's just name calling, like somebody looking at you and be like, yeah, you stupid little bitch or whatever. When actually I was with my abuser, I was married to him for almost 5 years, and he never called me a bitch until we got separated. He did it through text message. Other than that, he had never called me a bitch. He had said mean things to me, cruel things to me, horrible things to me. But our relationship was not one where he was coming home every night drunk, yelling at me, calling me a bitch, stuff like that. It wasn't that. And I think that's what most people assume that verbal abuse is that it's just name calling. Let me tell you, honey, verbal abuse is so much more than name calling. It's so much more. Again, this book will blow your mind. I am going to link it down below. If it was just that, for me, I would have known right away, I should get out of this relationship. He's calling me a B all the time. I think he began verbally abusing me probably within 3 or 4 or 5 months of us starting to date, but I had no idea. I thought it was just an anomaly here and there. But then once his abuse started in earnest, about a few months after we got married, there was 8 or 9 months that went by where I didn't know what was happening. I just thought, he's so mean and it hurts so much. And I'm so sad and I feel so oppressed and I feel so frustrated and so confused, and I just didn't know. And I started Googling because I was like, what is going on? And I came across verbal abuse, and then I came across this. And the reason why I didn't know what was going on is because my ex, incredibly intelligent, he never needed to call me a B. He was doing all the other things very well. Stonewalling, discounting, criticizing, defining behavior, blocking, undermining. So when I read this, it was a lot. Verbal abuse, for those of you who are wondering if you are experiencing it, is usually very secretive. That person does not usually verbally abuse you in front of other people, and that was true for me most of the time. It gets more intense over time, so if you think maybe you're getting verbally abused, start to pay attention to it and start to write down when you think you're being verbally abused, and then you can start to notice patterns. And I'm saying he because my channel is made for women, so if you're a man, just substitute in she or they, them, whatever their pronouns are. But I'm going to just speak to the heterosexual relationship that I had with my ex, who is a man and who identifies as a man. If he seems like he's angry at you, but then when you ask him, are you angry? He says no. that leads to cognitive dissonance. When you try to discuss something with them and let them know you're upset and it never gets to a resolve, and you always leave the conversation feeling like, I can never get a resolve. And for us, this happened in a scenario where I caught him flirting with another woman from work. And every time I brought it up to him for months and months and months, he lied. And so even though I was supposed to feel resolved, because he was telling me, oh no, I didn't go out with her. I haven't seen her. And really he had actually took her out on a date. But for 5 or 6 months, he was telling me, no, nothing happened. And I just didn't feel resolve. One, because I think I just knew at the bottom of my heart that he was lying. You constantly feel frustrated and you feel like you keep trying to explain yourself and explain your intentions, because often a verbal abuser will do the defining behavior by telling you what you're thinking. And my ex would say, you just always want to start a fight. You just want to fuck this up. You just want to do this. You just want to do that. And I would be like, no, oh my God, no, that's not what I want. I don't want to fuck this up. I don't want this. I don't want that. And I would always be trying to explain myself. And you get so frustrated because it doesn't really matter what you try to do. If someone is a verbal abuser, they are not going to ever just take what you say and say, oh, okay, honey, I believe you. I know you weren't trying to fuck this up. They don't. There is always an issue with what he thinks you said. So oftentimes I would be saying something and I would be trying to, I'm really hurt because you were lying to me about something, and he would make it about, well, you said that before you were really hurt because you stubbed your toe, and now you're saying it's this. And so you find yourself feeling almost a feeling of exasperation, almost like you can never win. That was the feeling I felt predominantly. I can never win conversations, especially when it was reaching a fever pitch. It was almost like I would just rather not talk, which, if you know me, is not me. I always felt like, what's wrong with me? Like I said, I didn't know what was going on. I knew I felt terrible inside, and I started to ask myself, what's wrong with me? Now, part of that was because it was also in conjunction with him removing himself from me emotionally. I think that was more a function of him becoming more and more narcissistic in our relationship, more than maybe being verbally abusive, but he was moving away from me emotionally, physically, spiritually, sexually, in every single way. And so I often was thinking, what's wrong with me? Why doesn't he want me? Why doesn't he love me? Why doesn't he want to talk to me? Why is he mean to me? Why doesn't he want to have sex with me? Etc. So it just really exasperated the scenario as it was. A verbal abuser will almost never want to share his feelings with you. You feel like you've got to drag them out of them. It makes you feel very isolated, especially if you're married. I think for me, it just felt like, why am I even married? I can't even talk to him about anything. This is a huge one. Verbal abusers will take an opposite view from you on just about everything there is to take an opposite view on. This was the most incredibly painful aspect of my life. If y'all watch my channel, you know that I laugh when I'm coping, but he did this horrible thing where once we got together, he started taking opposite views of everything. And for me, I believe so strongly in a few things. I believe in God. I believe in the dignity of all humanity. I'm just going to tell you just a few, for example. I'm a very passionate advocate. I believe in empathy. I believe that women should have a right to choose what to do with their body. I believe in lots of things that would be more on the liberal scale, let's say. My ex decided to take the opposite view on all those things that are very profoundly and deeply personal to me. But the biggest one of all that hurt me more than anything were two things he decided to take an opposite view of. Is one, I am very pro-black, and two, I am very pro-feminist, and three, I'm very pro-woman. And I know there's a little difference, but that's a video for another day. But he decided to be anti-black, to become really and truly anti-black, even though he is black himself. He was basically like the male version of Candace Owens. He also decided to become very, very, very angry at women in an outwardly facing way. I think he already struggled with hatred of women. I think he was already a misogynist. I think he was just a little bit low key. After we got married and I was becoming more liberal and more outwardly facing as well about my beliefs, he decided to just go full on opposite of me, everything. Those are huge areas. That was one of the most deeply destructive ways that he abused me, period. Because my womanhood, my identity, identity as a Black woman was under assault by him for months, actually for years. On Twitter, things he wrote and said, it was a hostile environment when we tried to talk about it. It was one of the biggest ways that he assaulted me that led to a form of emotional terror that I can't even really describe, and I don't know I'll ever get over. It was so profoundly painful, but it also happened in little ways too. So here's an example. I gave this example in one other video, but I'll just give it again. If I were like, oh wow, this guy's really blue today, he'd be like, that's not blue, like that's purple, are you dumb? Just kind of like that. He wouldn't even always have to say, are you dumb? But if he did say something mean, he would ask it as a question, so that if I said like, oh, that kind of hurts my feelings, he'd be like, well, I didn't say you were dumb, I asked. You know, but also verbal abusers, when they disagree with you, they don't just say, oh, I think it's kind of bluish, you know, bluish purple. Or they don't say, I feel like it's light blue today, or I believe that it's a little bit lighter blue than usual. Because when you say those statements, it's kind of like saying, well, you have your opinion and I have mine, and let's just respect each other's opinions. But he would always one-up me, and so it didn't matter what I said, you know, like, man, dang, that movie was really scary. Like, that movie was not scary. And then look at me like I was dumb. And so as a result, I felt belittled constantly belittled because of that dynamic of one-upping me in every way. But the biggest way with the identity stuff was just wrenching. Another way that verbal abusers abuse is by making you feel like you are not a separate person from them. And that is one way I can say I don't really feel like I understood how that was happening or how he was doing that, and I still really don't know, except for that in the end, I did not feel like I was a separate person from him. If that makes sense. I don't really know how that was established. I could give examples for all these other things, but for that one, I don't know how it was established. But what happened was when we split, when he moved out and he instantly discarded me and got with another woman, even though he told me he would never do that to me because that would make him a monster. He just went ahead and did it anyway and just decided to lie to me about it. But when he did that, I felt the extreme discard because, again, he's also a narcissist. I was dealing with the pain of being trauma bonded. I felt like I was losing a part of myself, my body, my identity. The visual image that I used to give to people was that it felt like I was getting my limbs cut off without anesthesia. It just was insanely painful. Yeah, I don't even know. Another way that you might be enduring verbal abuse is if you've never really said to him, like, just stop doing that, or cut it out, or like, boy, hush, or anything like that. Because, well, there's lots of reasons, but for me, I never did that stuff because I felt like it wouldn't feel like it was warranted. He would think that that wasn't warranted. Why are you doing that? Why are you saying that? Even though it was warranted several times, but also because of fear of what might happen if I say something like that. He is either angry about you in conversations about things you're saying or has no idea what you're talking about, which also leads to someone feeling very belittled. So for example, with us, we talked about porn many times, and he, for the entirety of our marriage, led me to believe he never looked at it. Never, not once, just wasn't an interest of his. And then when we were breaking up, he just said something really casually like, yeah, you know, I was really starting to do better, and then, you know, I got back on porn for a little while, and then I got off it again. And I was like, wait a minute, you told me that you never looked at it while we were married. You know, it's kind of like, for me, it was like, well, there's water under the bridge now, but you told me you never looked at it. And he was like, no, I never said that. And I'm like, well, yeah, you did. I was like, because I would have remembered if you had told me. He was like, yeah, I told you. And I was just like, no, you've maintained that you've never looked at it the entire time we were married. And he was just like, I don't know what you want, but I told you. And the feeling that I felt, because he also came back with such power and authority in that statement, was just like, well, it's gaslighting. If you're at the point where you can identify, yes, that was gaslighting, but also I just felt like he also wanted to make me feel dumb for thinking that we had talked about it when clearly we had. There's also a few things that if you find yourself in a relationship where you're feeling these certain things, that you are very likely in a verbally abusive relationship. What I found being a victim of verbal abuse is that it is entirely crazy making. You really do feel like you're going insane. One is you feel unable to write yourself after interactions. You just feel uncertain. I felt that almost all the time. Two is that you feel very lost. You don't even know what to say to somebody. I would want to tell somebody like, I'm so hurt, and I didn't even know how to say it. I just like, oh, we have bad conflict. He says we have bad conflict. And I knew it was so much worse than bad conflict, but I didn't even know how to explain it. I'd be like, he's just mean, you know? And that's sometimes when you're looking for help, that's not good enough. They'll be like, oh, I'm sorry, your husband's mean. Does he hit you? And I'd be like, no, but he's just really mean, which is just the tip of the iceberg, right? 3 is always feeling caught off guard. I always felt caught off guard. Part of that is because my ex was a pathological liar. He lied to me about everything. He probably lied to me about stuff I don't know he lied to me about. And he lied to me about stuff that he doesn't know that I know about. It just was an endless barrage of lies about everything. I mean, he would lie about what he had for breakfast, that kind of thing. It left me feeling constantly disoriented, constantly confused, and a constant state of cognitive dissonance. Number 6, and this was a huge one for me, is feeling fearful to ask for clarification. Oh my gosh, I never wanted to ask him for clarification because he would just go insane about it. Like if I would say, what do you mean by that? He'd be like, what do you mean? What do I mean? He literally would do that to me. He would literally yell, what do you mean? What do I mean? And I would immediately get scared and I would be like, I was just asking for clarification because, I just don't understand. And he'd be like, well, fine, I'll say it again just because you weren't listening, putting it back on me. Again, it's just another thing that makes you feel like you're going crazy. Another thing is that you feel like you don't know where you stand. Oftentimes I did not know where I stood with him. One time I told him he was like Jekyll and Hyde and he smacked his lips and got really mad at me, even though it was true. Feeling totally unprepared for broken promises is another huge one. He just always broke promises, always forgot things that were really important to me. My ex did a good job in some other ways, so he's not by any means a deadbeat or anything like that. But when things were really important to me, like say him not taking another girl on a date, or even like just getting me balloons for my 40th birthday, that's the only thing I asked him for and he didn't do it. Things like that, it just leaves you unprepared. Like, dang, especially given the dynamics of our relationship, I didn't ask for very much. I always tried to assume goodwill from him, and I feel like for the opposite, he always assumed the worst, that I was trying to manipulate him, trying to lie to him, trying to use him, trying to abuse him, he didn't really accuse me of cheating. That was one thing he never did, but he assumed when we were having a conversation without ever asking me clarification that my motives were the worst. And I was trying to show him what I needed from him by assuming his motives were the best and that his motives were good and kind, and his motives were almost never that. But I would seek clarification and he would still come back with disdain. If he ever sought me for clarification, which he almost never did, I would have to say, well, let me give you clarification on what I was saying because you're accusing me of something I'm not doing. He would accuse me of like, you're just being selfish right now. The reason why you're saying this is because you're just being selfish. And it could be me asking for him to turn the air up in the car because I'm hot. And he'd be like, you're just being selfish and you're the only one that you care about in the car. I would be like, well, let me just tell you for clarification, that's not the reason why. I'm not being selfish by asking. I'm just asking because I'm uncomfortable and I thought maybe if I told you I was uncomfortable that you'd maybe want to turn the air up a little higher. That's just an example, but things like that happen all the time. It's very exasperating. You feel a constant sense of uneasiness and sadness, and it's almost inexplicable. And it's about the person you love, and you wish that you could explain it to them, and you wish that you could tell them how much they're hurting you, and you wish that you could do anything to have them communicate with you in a way that made you feel loved. But that there's nothing you can say that will lead to that outcome, and that if you try, you will very likely end up feeling worse than before you said something. And so you feel this inexplicable level of sadness, confusion, and you feel trapped. And that was really a big, sad part for me as a communicator. Like I said, my degree is in speech communications, but I've always been an extrovert. I've always been a talker, a teacher, a leader, a communicator. I just love talking. And so to remove that element out of our relationship because it just wasn't safe was incredibly difficult for me personally, but it would be for anyone, even if you're not a talker. Usually you're in a relationship or a partnership or a marriage because you want to communicate with them. And before we got married, he was communicating with me just fine. There were signs, red flags that I missed, of course. Now, in hindsight, I can look back and see where I missed them, but it hurts to know I can literally never get my point across. I'll just keep trying and it will be like throwing salt into the ocean and trying to stop up the ocean or something like that. I could not get my brain to stop looping things he said. For example, one time I was trying to explain to him how I felt, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and he said, "Get the fuck out of here." And I was just like, I mean, it just like, it really hurt me. It was also one of the first times he'd ever said anything like that to me. So it was so jarring. I was just like, that's not something you would ever say to somebody you respect. I didn't even say that to him. I just was thinking that, like, who would say that to somebody they respect or love? That's terrible. And then in the context, telling him my deep vulnerability about this very vulnerable thing that happened to me and how I felt about it. And then I said to him, when you say stuff like that, it makes me not want to share my personal stories with you. And he was like, good. And I was just like, we were on the phone at the time, so I got off the phone with him just so I could cry. It was very, very sad. But that's an example of something that looped in my head over and over again. For the next 5 months, all I could think about was him articulating that, honestly, that I didn't know what I was talking about, but also that he didn't want to hear, that he didn't care. And there were things he said to me over the years that literally never went away. For 2 or 3 years. My brain was always looping them, and it hurt each time. And that's something that people don't quite understand about verbal abuse who've never been through it, is that verbal abuse can be worse than physical abuse, because when you get punched in the eye, yes, it hurts, yes, it's terrible, and it leaves a bruise, and it's awful to experience from someone you love, in the same way that hearing something terrible hurts, because it's experiencing something evil from someone you love. When the eye heals, force of like being hit and all of the things that happen, that heals. Mentally, you still have the mental anguish, but with verbal abuse, when it loops back in your head, you feel that same pain over again, and then a month later, that same level of pain over again and over again. And then if you're living with someone who's verbally abusive, you are feeling that over and over and over and over again about several different interactions. From reading this book and understanding my experience and what I went through, I was probably experiencing roughly 30 to 50 verbally abusive behaviors a day for probably 2.5 years straight. And the level of toxicity and trauma that caused me is unthinkable. And I know it sounds crazy to say this, but I would have much rather him been actually beating me, but it feels like it would have been easier. The level of emotional and psychological torture that he put me through, he could say to me, and he did in a matter of words, like, well, prove it then. You know, and it'd be very difficult for me to explain to people when I started telling people, well, this is how it happens, and this is the context. And then, you know, before I had these terms, it was just like, he's just so mean. And it was so much different than that. It felt like he was literally punching me in my eyeballs every day. The way that he was able to even gaslight that was what I was experiencing added a very painful layer of oppression. I'm going to end there. If you have any questions, if you want to ask me any questions personally or just interact with me, feel free to email me at outheretrynasurvive@gmail.com, and leave me a comment if you have been through verbal abuse and how long you've been out of it and what books and resources you've used, or anything you'd like to add. I would love to hear from you. I'm going to try to respond back to everybody. Please join my newsletter list. I send out a very brief once a week on all things Black womanhood, mental health advocacy, and verbal and narcissistic abuse. Promise not to spam you. It's not long, just a little breath of fresh air. And also I highlight things that I'm up to, what series are coming up, if I'm doing any sort of giveaways, and also I'm going to be offering some one-on-ones and also some courses in the fall. So if you want to know more about that, I'm sorry, not the fall, in January. So if you want to know more about that, please sign up for my email newsletter list. Don't forget, I have a book right here, Grace Actually, Stories of Faith, Love, Loss, and Black Womanhood, a compilation of blog posts that I wrote over the past decade, poetry, some gems hopefully you'll like. Thanks so much for watching.